Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Today's session is about creating sustainable business models within the nonprofit sector. My name is Bryan Kieler. I'll introduce myself here in a second when we go over just a brief background / introduction, if you will. Let me click on the right slide here. Here we go. So again, on behalf of PNC Bank, we're proud to be the presenting sponsor, and thank you all for coming today, and proud to be here and happy to be here to talk about creating sustainable business models. A little bit about me. I'm going to bring a little bit of a practitioner and also educator aspect to this. I have roughly 18 plus years in the banking experience, banking / CDFI experience, I should say. For those of you who are not familiar with CDFIs and that are also within the nonprofit sector, I would suggest they're probably one of the secret elements out there. A CDFI is a community development financial institution that has been designated by the U.S. Treasury that banks, foundation, and government entities invest into them to do work that we can't do at banks. And so I'm genuinely a community development person back at a bank. I have the pleasure of overseeing community development throughout the state of Michigan for PNC. And so I'll talk a little bit about what that is just for briefly, but then we'll dive into this. Also, some of the material that I'm going to share with you today, I teach strategy and strategic planning at Walsh College. Also, I do teach community development finance at University of Detroit Mercy and corporate finance at Northwood. And so bring a little bit of a background again from academics, but also hands-on playing with financial modeling and primarily in the nonprofit space is kind of where my team and I really focus our work at. At PNC, we do a lot of different products and services, and I'm not going to read all the slides to the group here, but really at the end of the day, we're charged with overseeing our Community Reinvestment Act. So to make sure that we're a great corporate citizen. So the past 40 years since the inception of the exam, we're one of the few banks that have had an outstanding CRA rating for the entire exam cycle. So in essence, bringing my academic side back to the table, for 40 years, we've been a 4.0 student. And so we recently made some more commitments to say, how do we take this to the next level? And we work around like opportunity zone financing, we do bond financing, but even investing into social enterprise models for nonprofits. And so with that, we're going to kind of talk a little bit more into that aspect of things. Really looking at like, why does this matter, or why are nonprofits looking at this? And a copy here, I have a copy of my dissertation, a link to it. I did my doctoral degree in helping nonprofits think about reducing the reliance on government grants and efforts to become self-sustaining. One of the challenges we've seen since the Welfare Act is the federal government in the United States has really pushed to have nonprofits be that conduit to provide the services, if you will, to the underserved community, right? And unfortunately, due to recessionary times, we see highs and lows of funding to the nonprofits. And we also see, especially like very relevant in COVID days or COVID lens, the need for those hurting or needing assistance is greater than ever. Right. So I think COVID serves as a great example of us that we can see even challenges within suburban areas where many people might have thought it was only more an urban core kind of challenge. The findings of my research is a couple of things. I partnered with one nonprofit leader on the West Coast, and I see this true with much of my work within the CDFI space and also in the bank space, is many of our nonprofit leaders having limited resources are trying to wear multiple hats to try to figure out how do we make this work happen? And how do we improve quality of services? So often there's been a lack of systemic processes when we think about the approach of how to deliver services, how to connect with constituent bases, and also even how to connect like with the shareholders or the stakeholders, right? So often we will see nonprofits trying to chase what the foundation community is asking of them to achieve a certain grant, but it's also putting even more strains just to hit that reporting requirements for the foundation. Right, so I would challenge in some conversations to actually push back and help educate the funders what challenges this puts onto the nonprofit, and maybe could they share their current reporting to make it easier for that nonprofit. At the end of the day, if a funder, if it's a bank foundation, if it's a foundation community or a government entity is funding the given nonprofit, it's because we believe in the work that you're doing. We believe in the quality of work. We believe in the programming that's servicing the individuals and helping to offer a sense of dignity to those who are being served. And so in some elements, we have to kind of question ourselves as funders to say, are we doing this because it makes it easy for us? Or can we really kind of help that nonprofit and in doing their work. Also, we see a lack of alignment results as far as KPIs, so key performance indicators, right? So what's really important to the nonprofit, and I believe in much of the work I do at PNC, when we get into this space, it's really getting vulnerable in the conversations and helping the funder, again, if it's a bank or if it's a foundation, understand the importance of what you're doing and the impact for the community, because we only see it from our perspective often, right? We have to challenge ourselves to think about it from a 360 degrees. But at the same time, if there's things that are important metrics for us as funders, to be very transparent and allowing the foundation partner, or I'm sorry, the nonprofit partner to know what those metrics are and come up with dashboards to help us really understand if we're driving the needle. The last point a lot of the findings in my research found was a lack of a defined sustainability plan, right? At the end of the day, our nonprofits are doing such great work and they're trying to balance those resources. And so often when we are in more of a reactive environment, it's kind of hard to step back and think about the strategic planning and the process for improvement and continuous improvement. The backgrounds I mentioned, when we look at this, there's a lot of research to show the nonprofit sector is really key in providing a quality, affordable healthcare, access to quality, healthy foods, affordable housing, public and safety, really revitalizing the communities that they serve and the given geography that they serve. And so for us as a funder, I'm challenging ourselves, and I challenge our bank to say, how can we really bring resources to help entities do this? And part of this funding, and we're going to talk a little bit about this, is looking at how do we diversify the funding streams. Much of the research here shows as well that roughly 80% of nonprofits' revenue, and it depends on the source that you look at, 70 to 80% really comes from government grants. And so in some respect, for example, if you're a homeless shelter and you win a $5 million grant from the government to provide the services, statistically in this element, you are now 20% short of actually fulfilling that program, right? We need quality staff to do the program. There's auxiliary services, there's programming and expenses that are just not reimbursable. So what this often does is this forces many nonprofits to think about, how do we have a great capital campaign? Or how do we have that Hail Mary pass at the end of the year where we can try to fill that gap through a fundraising campaign? And by all means, I'm not trying to say that you avoid those, right? You definitely want to go after those and make sure you have those asks. But another approach too is to say, are there things that we can do that will help us earn unrestricted revenue? Are there things that we can do to help us fill the gap, right? These have led many nonprofits leaders really to think about different strategies and to diversify their revenues. Now, the elements I would challenge the group to think about is really, how do you balance these demands? Right. So for example, if you're going to look at launching a social enterprise model, and one of the most well-known company logos and organizations in this space is Goodwill Industries, right? They're worldwide. It's one of the most recognized logos within the space of it. But at the end of the day, as a leader, you got to think about, you have limited capital, human capital, right? Facilities, et cetera. And so if you're going to start another line of business where now you're trying to make some sort of widget or make some sort of for-profit entity, how are you going to align the resources? And if all of a sudden, if one element of the business is pulling more strain on your resources, how do you decide how you allocate the time? If all of a sudden the social enterprise is making tons of money, if you will, right, a surplus of funds, how do you decide, how do you allocate those resources to serve the mission versus do we invest and do we grow in it? At the same time, if the business is starting to decline a little bit, do you pull funds from the nonprofit, the unrestricted funds that might be there, to fund that for-profit business model to really kind of help fund those growths? So these are often challenges we have to think through. And at the same time, what do we tell our stakeholders, both internally and externally? If our staff sees us doing a social service model within our entity, and then also sees us selling some sort of widget that we're making as a for-profit entity, what is the message we're sending to our stakeholders, and how do we help show alignment of why this makes sense for the organization? And lastly, how do we measure success in the space? right? It's really interesting to me. So often over the years, I've talked with many nonprofit leaders and their staff, and there's this misnomer out there: as a nonprofit, you shouldn't make profit, right? As a nonprofit, we shouldn't make profit. And one of the things I always like to look at is, without margin, there's no mission. We need to be sustainable, and it's very okay for nonprofits to make a surplus. Now, they're not going out and paying huge bonuses to their team, et cetera, but they're using that surplus. Research shows that funding for nonprofits from grants, it has seasonality to it, and there's highs and lows, right? And just recently, we've seen many funders in the foundation side, and even us at PNC Bank, pivot what they would normally fund from the foundation side because of the impact of COVID. Right, in the beginning of the year, we did so much of our funding around financial education and supporting youth programming that really brought masses of people together, which are definitely value programming. I'm not trying to discredit them. But early in the year, as a senior leadership team, we said, you know what, we're going to almost like Maslow hierarchy of needs. And we funded around the shelter systems, food insecurity systems. The impact of COVID really threw a curveball. And the challenge is, we don't know what the next COVID is going to be. There could always be some sort of emergency that happens in a community, right? In the perfect world, the bank and the foundation side, and even our foundation world, we would love it if we just go out of business. We're no longer needed. Unfortunately, we just show in our economy, there's highs and lows. And so these are challenges for nonprofits to say, how do you really stay true to who you are and make sure you don't get caught into that mission drift and really drift into something that is beyond what the organization is? Because at the end of the day, if it's not done thoughtful and it's not in alignment and you don't have the resources, now as a nonprofit leader, you're balancing two challenges. Ultimately, the first challenge was how do we keep the nonprofit sustainable and make sure that we can meet our mission and serve our clients as we're chartered to do. And now we're saying we have a startup business that we created this headache that's just draining our resources and creating further challenges for us. So how do we kind of balance these pressures? Right, and it can be very frustrating for the senior leadership, for the board of directors, even for the staff to say, who are we? Even the constituents that you serve, I mean, it might start sending mixed messages within the constituent base. Sorry, switch over to sides. So what is the right kind of structure? What we're seeing more than ever is organizations, I mean, and again, a nonprofit is a business model. So we can't really think of it differently that way. In our business model, we're going to have highs and lows. We're going to get hit with recessionary times. And I think the more that we can be transparent and the more we can be open and connected to our stakeholders, the better we can kind of tell our story as nonprofit leaders and also to our funders to say why this makes sense, right? So from the manager side of things, being flexible, being quick and innovative as far as our process, and realize the conditions are going to change. Right, I see many of our nonprofit leaders always focusing historically on urban cores, and now the reality of suburban poverty is really kind of highlighted for many of those nonprofits who serve underserved. I read one paper that said roughly 70% of Americans are one paycheck from a hardship, and that's urban core and suburban America. Right, so that's a challenge out there, and if your mission is to serve those who are experiencing financial hardship, it's going to really pull onto you. In the same space, it's very important that we think about how do we create alignment and make sure that we're funding what's in alignment with where our funders are at, but at the same time, we know when to say no. Now, that's really hard to do, right? So at the end of the day, as a nonprofit leader, if we have money in our bank and we know that the need of someone coming to us is legitimate, but we're not getting funding for that, we're better off saying no to that request because it's going to pull our limited resources as it is and keep us from serving those who we already serve, those who we're funded to serve, or the programming that we're funded to serve. And so this is a number of the challenges why nonprofits get challenged a little bit into saying, how do we stay sustainable, remain sustainable within the funding model? So in implementing the strategy, it's really, and this is kind of even talking about like in social enterprise models, right? We want to really think about through leadership and make sure the board of directors are on board as well about who is the organization, who are we not, where are we going? I think it's very important as well to think about, how do we know when we get there, right? So a lot of this starts to create some sort of dashboards and some sort of metrics around benchmarks to say, okay, who is it we're serving? If we're looking to launch a social enterprise or build out this element within our nonprofit, sorry, I hit my mouse there. Who are we going to serve? How do we know if we're doing quality work? How do we know we create satisfaction? And how do we measure success? Now, in these conversations, I think it's very important to also talk to the funders to let them know, especially if you're fortunate enough to get foundation grants or startup funding for some of these sectors. At the same time, within the banking world, to help us understand as the bank, to tell that story, help the bank understand, how do we know how the business is going to grow? Sorry, I have a little visitor coming in the background here. How do we know if the business is going to grow? And what are the metrics? So if you have assumptions to say that you believe that you're going to serve another 15 people this year or 20 people, what does that do to the revenues? And what does that do to the expenses? Right? Really kind of help the banker understand the assumptions and how things move forward that way. One of the challenges we see often is many of us are running, and we're running fast, and we're running hard. This illustration here, and again, the text is a little bit small in font, so I'll kind of highlight some of the overview of it. But what we see so often is we're running really fast, and there's a lot of strains on us. But off to the left, almost like a firefighter, we see organizations, not that firefighters do this actually, but we'll see when we're trying to put out a fire, right? We'll see organizations going in every which direction. At the end of the day, the employee feels they ran really fast, they did a lot of work, but if you will, because of lack of alignment, they're almost working against each other. And unfortunately, we see this in small organizations, and we see this in large organizations. I would challenge, sometimes in larger organizations, we see this because silos within the organization, and now the larger nonprofits are very true of this as well. And the small organizations, we see this too, because we have limited human capital, and it's one person wearing 12 hats, right? And so how do I align my time and stuff like that? It's a challenge that way. The more we can get strategic in our alignment within our processes, right, and engage our stakeholders to help us with this, it will really kind of help us tell that story. And I think this is an area for much of the nonprofits, and especially as we grow the sustainability organization, to try to lean into our volunteer base to tell the story as well, right? How do we capture the voice of the volunteers? And so many, I worked with a couple nonprofits that might have 2 to 3 full-time employees, but they're fortunate enough to have a 100-member volunteer base. They just need the direction, right? And they need to make sure that we can create that alignment, and it can be a little bit hard that way. The link on the bottom, I know the slides are going to be shared, is around the Baldrige framework. So Malcolm Baldrige is a total quality excellent management system that has been adopted actually through the National Institute of Science Technology. The largest program within this division of the government is NASA, but this is something that was adopted under quality excellence underneath President Reagan's era. When we're looking to create or think about creating some sort of business with an alignment, I can share some examples. I think it's really important for the nonprofit leaders to pull back and really keep in the forefront, what is our mission, vision, and values? Okay. How do we know if something's really contributing to our goals? And what is the connection? How do we tell our story? So for example, I've seen some nonprofit leaders have some excess capital and they buy a franchise. It could be an ice cream store or something like that. Unless your mission and vision, if you will, is workforce development and create jobs, all that's going to do is start pulling you away from your function as a nonprofit, your core mission. Sorry, I don't think there's a timer on this slide. Pull you away from your mission, if you will, and create another challenge where you're trying to figure out that sector, right? Now, one of the greatest organizations I've seen do this outside of Goodwill, because people know Goodwill a lot, but they do this really well, is actually when I was in Ohio for a couple of years, there was a nonprofit called Medina Creative Housing. What Medina did, they actually worked with people who had disabilities on various levels of the autism spectrum. And at the end of the day, one of the challenges they had was as the young adults started getting a little bit older, were the working age, they didn't have opportunities to jobs, or they want to go after the challenges of where it was acceptable to pay somebody $1 a day kind of thing. And the families were almost okay with it in a sense of they wanted their son or daughter to do something. They wanted to have a sense of purpose, if you will, as far as being productive. So Medina actually partnered with the local manufacturing base. And one of the things within the autistic spectrum is often individuals, depending on the severity of the spectrum they're at, they can do rote tasks extremely well, right? So we start thinking some of the manufacturing processes and stuff where it's just very repetitive. And for some of us, it might start to get a little boring, I guess, for lack of better words. This was something they excelled at. And so Medina started working with the manufacturing industries and they actually had to create a mock-up facility to replicate the behaviors and to show an even interruption of process to show how the individual would respond and teach them cues where if something didn't seem right, like to raise your hand kind of thing, and then a supervisor could come over. Fast forward, Medina said, we're training people to do jobs that they're not really catering the full spectrum of what they do and what we do here. That organization today has 9 social enterprises, one of which is the coffee shop that Starbucks actually relocated to the other side of town because everyone was going to this coffee shop because they said, you know what, if I'm going to spend $4 for a cup of coffee, I'd rather support the mission. And to me, the coffee was just as good, right? They did the coffee shop. They had a little eatery. They had a horsebacking ranch. They had a doggy daycare as well. And so what happened was the doggy daycare almost generates about $500,000 in surplus just to fund their mission. Mind you, unrestricted surplus, right? So for the nonprofit leaders out there, we know that most of our grant funding comes with some sort of restrictions, right? It's like playing Monopoly, do not pass go, do not collect $200, you'll go to jail. You have to be very careful that you don't violate that within federal grants. And so this idea to say, is there something we can do to help create that funding that's in alignment with who we are, can be very beneficial. Now, I think at the end of the day, this is very important to make sure that the stakeholders are on board, that we tell our story, we can make sure we capture it well. And so I know Brenda talked a little bit earlier about using LinkedIn and marketing out there. There's also some about strategic planning, which this touches into a little bit here as well. But really, we really need to first clarify and then decide, okay, does this make sense for us? And one of the biggest challenge I think is, as nonprofit leaders, we stop to say, well, we don't have this talent or we can't pay for this talent. And so we don't know how to run a business, or maybe we don't know finance that well. So could we then maybe find that opportunity through a board member, right? Could we possibly partner with one of the colleges and stuff for guidance? And we're seeing some of the universities start to say, we could be a great corporate steward too. So this doesn't necessarily have to be talent within inside your own organization or use your human capital, right? Then clarify, who are we and who are we not? Does this make sense if we're going to launch a social enterprise of who we are? And one, I'll be honest, most of us bankers, we see balance sheets and they're black and white and income statements. We're not good at seeing that story right away. So we need help from the nonprofit leaders. How does this connect? If there is a shortcoming inside of the human capital element of someone to run this skill set, bring someone into the organization, even if it's a volunteer base, and help us see the connection of how you're growing your bench to really kind of diversify that. And then from there, we need to really think about where are we going? Okay, how are we going to get there and how do we measure success? Right? I'm going to share an example here, but for example, most startup businesses, for-profit, nonprofit, take time to become sustainable. We don't make money day one, typically speaking. So how do we balance those pressures? And how do we keep that long view, both inside of our organization, but also outside the organization? So as leaders, it's really important that we kind of create that structure and strategy and set that vision for our workforce and for our stakeholders. And one of the things I find really interesting is really set that a benchmark for the best in class. Right? I heard a different analogy. Brenda earlier talked about a coffee shop, like a mom and pop coffee shop. And she said, like, kind of look at what's Starbucks doing or what's Tim Hortons doing kind of thing. But the benchmark can be a larger organization, or sometimes it can even be outside of our sector, right? It's just who does something really well if it's a key characteristic that's important for us to really kind of succeed. And then ultimately, how do we really create a learning environment in this? How do we have to think about what are the benchmarks we're going to capture, the key data points, to use that data to make sure we can continuously improve that model. Right? I think that's one of the biggest challenges I see inside the banking world and the foundation world is so often, and I work a lot with Kresge Foundation, like Skillman and Kellogg, and we'll pull back. And the question they ask is, okay, we made this investment in this community for 15 years. Have we made improvement? And one of our biggest challenges to answer that question is this work is not happening in a vacuum. So we're not just working against one variable, right? We can look at even the impact of COVID and how it impacts even some of the most wealthiest families into a setback. And so all of a sudden we get these curveballs in there. And so it's kind of really hard that we're trying to make movement inside of a multivariable kind of world environment. So when we think about the data that we should look at measuring, focusing around financial performance, and one of our greatest challenges in financial performance, and even when you're talking with your banker on this or your funders on this, is that's like driving your car in the rearview mirror, right? It's good to know, are we profitable? Are we earning a surplus in the nonprofit space? But just because we had a killer year in 2019, 2020 is not that way, right? And when we were on our boardroom tables and we were planning, what does 2020 look like? I don't think any nonprofit organization or for-profit was planning for the impact of COVID, right? So even the best laid plans with the brightest minds, unfortunately, we get these curveballs. What are key metrics for your given industry? As I mentioned earlier, benchmarks against best in class. And then when we look at from a statistician side of things, anytime we try to see a trend or see what we're doing, we should always have 3 data points or 3 sets of data, right? Because if we just look at 19 and 20, for example, that just gives us a line in one direction. And it doesn't really help us to see how we're going over a continuum or a period of time more so. Lastly is data that's easily attainable. I'm on a couple of nonprofit boards and we've tried to build the best mousetrap sometimes. And the data is either extremely delayed. It just takes forever to get the reports from the various lines of business. And I see it in the banking world too. Or it's just so hard to access that it's unrealistic, right? And so if we can't really get the data, let's look at a different way of measuring it. Let's look at data points that we can get so we can have better information to guide us. A little bit element of Baldrige, and they've actually started focusing a lot inside the nonprofit space, the nonprofit sector. But as I mentioned, what it does is it actually looks at a 7-strategy approach that is in direct alignment with the organization's mission, vision, and values. So who is this organization? Now, the million-dollar question always here is to say, should we change? Should our mission be modified because of the environment, right? And this is always hard to say, is the environment a fad? Or is this a new change in the way consumers want something? We know countless of stories of organizations that failed to change and didn't take competition for granted, or they took it for granted. Maybe we can look at Blockbuster, Kmart, Kodak, right? The list kind of goes on within the space. And then the other thing is even technology is changing. How do we deliver our services and how can we use that technology? And so inside of here, it really is at the core of keeping, again, the core values of the organization really front and center. But then how do we use data and knowledge management to make sure that we have the right leadership in place? We're capturing the voice of our customers. We have the right strategy in place to make sure we're delivering the services of those that need the service. And also what's changing maybe within that segment or that sector, right? So if we do social services in the healthcare sector, what did the Affordable Care Act do for us? What will the potential Affordable Care Act reform mean for us, right? These are challenges that we kind of have to have on our radar. And how do we really connect with our workforce? So much of our workforce are really kind of connecting, and they're the front line for our constituent base. They're the ones helping to make sure that we really deliver on those services. And then same thing within our operations. How do we improve efficiencies and reduce waste with operations, improve quality? And then at the end of this is the results. So how do we integrate the results within each of these buckets? And so you could actually go to baldrige.com and you could actually get a copy of the framework that would walk through the questions as leaders we could think about this. What I would say is Baldrige is a great tool. It's a little bit hard to take pieces of it. It's either as an organization where we're going to drink that Kool-Aid or we're not. But there's some great tools and resources to really help organizations, big and small, really think about building a system around total quality improvement. And within the space around operations, there is the element of balancing the pressures as well of like a social enterprise model, and also looking at making sure you stay true to who the organization is. And please, I'm talking here, which is really weird, but there's questions. Please chime in off to the side. I'm kind of keeping an eye out over there. The core values of this is really organizational personal learning. How do we make sure that the organization stays agile? How do we really focus on creating value and being socially responsible for the resources and for those who we're serving? And really use data-informed decisions, right? So it's not just at the gut level. I think there are some great senior nonprofit leaders out there that have been in the space for a very long time. And so often their gut is very right. But what does that do for our younger leaders that might not have that same kind of just gut guess, if not guess, if you educated guess, if you will, that's better. So inside the Baldrige again, how efficient are our operations? So this allows us to really look at this, because one of the things is as we think about the idea of trying to launch a social enterprise, the other element that we're looking at is how do we reduce our unneeded expenses, right? How do we make sure we don't have waste in our processes? How effective are our operations? Are we really achieving the quality results that we say we're set out to do? As I talked about, there's the 7 elements that we look at within the Baldrige side of things. Often what this will do, and we think through this, and especially if we do a social enterprise model or in the nonprofit side, is I think it's very important to think about the SWOT analysis for the organization. So often I think people just think SWOT is the entire company. I would challenge we look at the strengths and weaknesses, kind of focus that more internally. When we look at our opportunities and our threats, how do we look at it as external, right? Threats and or risks, if we say it that way, sounds bad. But I would say as a banker is that risk and threats is in every model. We just need to, as leaders, think about how do we think through it and how do we mitigate them? How do we try to avoid those, right? So banks are in the business of risk. And so at the end of the day, that's kind of what we do that way. And so it's really important that we have kind of a plan and we think through those segments. Another element that you can look at, and my research in the dissertation actually blended on this as well, is blending the balanced scorecard into the Baldrige. There's pros and cons of the balanced scorecard. Much of it is some organizations or some research out there shows it's more of a top-down kind of push strategy. But the reason I really like the balanced scorecard for organizations to think about is it helps to give a framework to get away from just financial processes. Right, so this was actually developed in the 90s by Kaplan and Norton. And there's a lot of emphasis around learning and growth. How do we continue to improve processes within the organization? And to make sure at the heart of everything is the vision, the strategy of it. And how do we really measure our internal processes for continuous improvement as well? And this is going to be something very important for nonprofit leaders as you think about trying to make one balancing, keeping the nonprofit sustainable, but at the same time, making sure that we're giving a desired result, a desired outcome for the customer base. The one element I found some of the best nonprofits doing inside of one, just in their organization, but also two, with a social enterprise model as well, is thinking of some sort of financial dashboard. These here, if you will, are just for illustration purpose, so please don't try to zone in on these. The writing is a little small there. But what I would say is it's very important to a couple of things. Is I'm on about 6 nonprofit boards right now, from organizations that are $2 million in annual revenue up to one's about $70 million in annual revenue. And when it comes to the finances or the financial health of the organization, almost 80% of the board looks to 2 to 3 people and say, how are we doing? Right? So the one on the right, I really like as far as think about a strategy of color coding a dashboard for the firm. We did this in one of the organizations, and now we have one of our community partners, right? She represents the community we serve, and she's admittedly said financials are not her strength. But now when we have this color-coded system, she can, in a very layman way, say, I know red is bad. What the heck's going on in this bucket? Right? And we can get the finance people to say, okay, stay away from the accounting verbiage, and let's just talk openly. And it helps us make an informed decision to really kind of guide it. At the same time, I think it's very important for nonprofits, as any organization, to really keep a dashboard on key metrics that are important for the organization. So for example, before I previously funded a halfway house, a prisoner reentry program that had one county contract. That was 100% of the revenue. And one of the metrics previously was they had to average a 90% occupancy every night, but they rolled it for a 90-day period, right? So it was a look back kind of measurement. And the nonprofit, if you think about it, most well-to-do communities don't want a prisoner reentry halfway house in their neighborhood, right? So we're not really seeing these in downtown Birmingham or downtown Rochester. As bad as it sounds, they should be able to go everywhere. But the reality is we see these in either disinvested neighborhoods or perceived disinvested neighborhoods. And this halfway house served people who had addiction problems and typically had multiple drug charges and sometimes some minor crime to really kind of support their drug habit, okay? And for them to leave their employer that would employ them to then get to the halfway house, they didn't have a public car, so they were doing mass transit. They passed about 15 of their demons. So if they had that bad day at work, it was very easy for them to say, I need this drink, or I need this drug, I need to get out of my head. And so the nonprofit started to talk to their constituents and say, okay, when you slipped or when you relapsed, why? What happened? They actually went after and got a grant from the county that was funding them to buy a transportation bus. The local foundation gave them a grant to put a counselor on that bus. And they only had 2 manufacturers in that area that were employing these individuals. So every day they would go there and they would pick them up. That way, if client A had a really hard day and he needed that drink or she needed that drink, the counselor was there to talk with them and be with them on that bus to make sure they didn't have the relapse. The other thing they did is they started overstaffing a little bit because they knew naturally just someone wouldn't show up. Either they went to go visit a friend out of town or something like that, not in a negative mannerism. They just didn't need the halfway house that night, right? Because they didn't have to necessarily go all the time. And what they did is they allowed it to start protecting their revenue. They started measuring something on a monthly basis that was very important for their funding. You could also look at covenants. If you have loan covenants, often foundations will put funding covenants, et cetera. So dashboards can really be helpful. Also, even if you say, if whatever the surplus is of my social enterprise, 20% of the profit gets invested back into it. The rest of the profit goes into serving our mission, right? These are different things that we can kind of look at. So integrating the social mission or social enterprise. The nonprofit that I worked with, they were actually a little bit smaller nonprofit. In their peak year, almost just under $800,000 in revenue. And what we can see here, and it's a little bit hard to see for illustration purpose, but they started to integrate a small social enterprise. Now, 2 things that I think in year 1, when they first started in 15, they thought they were gonna get $200,000 to $300,000 in revenue right away because they had promising conversations with funders. It really didn't pan out the way they thought. The neat thing is though, slowly they are starting to get revenue. And this was actually, the revenue never got, when we started working on the dissertation together, less than about 5 to 6% of their funding. But this was 100% unrestricted funding, right? So over time, and one of the challenges for this nonprofit leader, smaller team, less than 8 people on the team, full-time employees, the executive director was doing everything. Happened to be a male, so when he was working, if the social service programming took precedence, he focused on that. When in his free time, he was able to dedicate time to put out proposals, now to social media, right? You would start to see it. And then later in the year, in 18, he started to get a little bit more aggressive with it. And we saw some growth. But this could be an area that we have to think about as a nonprofit leader. Do we have that human capital? If we don't, do we have a great board member that might be able to champion that for us? Now, the challenge is board members are never sustainable forever, typically speaking, or we don't want to count on them. But how do we really leverage this to start to build resources that maybe eventually we can even hire somebody, right? Or could we make like some sort of commission based that helps feed this? So there's a lot of variables you could think through with that. Here's a sample of benchmarking. This organization, what they kind of did is they were part of an affiliate. So throughout the state they're in, there was about 70 of them. And they did dashboards, and I apologize, this got cut off here, but they had 10 key metrics that were important to them. And what they did is they said, you know what, we're in a little bit unique sector. So we're just going to compare ourselves to our affiliates of how we're doing. And they're the dark lines, or the dark dots, right? And the affiliates, the average of the affiliates were the non-filled dots on the chart. But they can start looking at this and to say, why are our peers outperforming us? Right. The one thing I love about community development bankers and the nonprofit space is we like typically hug. We're not against each other, right? We're all trying to solve this problem. We're coming together. So no one keeps this data like it's prized possessions, or they won't let you know the secret sauce. But the challenge in the research, it continues to show there's huge concentrations within funding. And so how do we really tell this story, and how do we diversify this revenue story? This is actually from the Institute of Nonprofits news. But we continue to see there's a lot of nonprofits, if you will, that are still have concentrations of maybe 1 to 2 revenue streams, right? There's only about a third of the sector has 4 or more revenue streams when we look at it. And so as leaders, we need to really focus on how do we kind of bring this together? How do we really align the resources and create clarity within it and hold accountability on both sectors? I see our time, we're getting a little bit near. So again, I'll have the slides out there, but talking with funders, a couple of things is there's a number of different funders, so make sure who you're talking with. Not all banks are the same. Some banks are a little bit more aggressive in the nonprofit space. There are CDFIs, the foundations, and really help the funders think through your strengths in this area, your weaknesses, and how they're mitigated, right? How will you manage the expansion? How will you allocate resources? How is the proposed expansion in alignment with the firm's mission, vision, and values? And I will kind of open it for questions. I can stay over a little bit here. I know we're at time in that respect, but